Welcome to Westbrook's COVID Conversations. Today we're in the UK with a fireside chat with Paul Stevens, the co-founder of UK-based ASK Partners. Maybe to give a bit of background on Paul, Paul is the co-founder of ASK and shares responsibility for credit due diligence and investor relations of the business. Importantly, he's been involved in the banking sector for over 40 years, the last 25 of which has exclusively been spent in property finance. And as such, he has a deep and established network in that market. In 1995, Paul established Investec Bank PLC's European property finance business, and under his management grew it to over £3.5 billion sterling. In April 2010, Paul assumed a wider role as the co-head of Investec's specialist private bank and was responsible for over 500 people in 7 different European locations. Paul, it's great to have you.
Hi, Dino.
Paul, I'd love to chat to you a little bit today around COVID-19 and I suppose take a little bit of your experience out of how COVID-19 has compared to some of the crises gone by that obviously you were very much involved in the banking sector during. So maybe to start, a simple question. When you look at COVID-19 and you maybe compare it to GFC in 2008, just how severe has the direct initial impact of COVID-19 been in the UK and I suppose to your knowledge set specifically in the property market?
Yeah, well, Dino, I think thanks for the introduction firstly, and for the part about 40 years in business. Makes you feel quite old. But yeah, in answer to your question, I think it's early days now to see what the impact will be on UK property. But my view is that the 2008 GFC will prove to be much worse. Back then, banks were lending in a crazy fashion, you know, particularly towards sort of 2006, 7 and into 2008. They were basically lending to feed securitization vehicles. It seemed to us, I mean, we were originating for our own balance sheet. So I'd say we were far more cautious in terms of the assets that we were bringing on within the property sector. But within the capital markets businesses, I think that there was a drive to just originate any kind of property-related debt because the market was there to securitize, and it really didn't matter what the risk looked like, where it was, what the fundamentals of the sector in which they were lending on were going. It was just so long as a fee was earned and they could parcel it up and pass it on to institutions, it was absolutely fine. So yeah, I think that there are very marked differences. I think that residential prices were spiraling in the northeast of England and in Ireland. Fundamentals have been lost, and looking back, those prices or those deals were, you know, the price points that developments were being undertaken in other parts of the country, I say apart from London, weren't sustainable. London generally fared quite well, even in the aftermath of 2008. We didn't see much price reductions, and if I look back at the Investec book, London was the area that we had least problems with. It was outside of there where I guess lenders were being driven because prices for lending in London were just coming down to a level that, you know, we couldn't really afford off of a balance sheet where we needed to whenever you need to earn a certain amount of income.
Paul, while we're on the topic of pricing and valuations, I mean, in 2008, you made the point that there was a lot of debt available and that perhaps propped up pricing. Are we in a similar movie, specifically in the UK now with COVID? What do you think the immediate impact will be on property pricing in the current context?
No, I think, look, I think if you look back in 2008, capital constraints were nowhere near as severe as they were post that period. Regulation increased dramatically post 2008, and capital buffers were put in place. And I think banks, well, I don't think, I know that banks are far more better capitalized and were being better capitalized for this very problem that's hit us. So in 2008, the focus was really about maintaining liquidity. Now, banks are still fairly liquid. This crisis hasn't really affected liquidity, or in fact, the banking sector. What will affect them is, what will affect the banks is post this crisis, and what problems stem from some of the deals that have been done that can't be seen at the moment. For instance, if you're lending on, a portfolio of student accommodation where you've got a development coming out of the ground, you may miss the September market here. It's very important to get those open for September, and that causes you an extra year. So I don't think the crisis is going to be, my own view is that this will be a fairly short, sharp shock to the system. There will be a recovery based around pent-up demand as soon as lockdown finishes, and particularly if a successful vaccine is produced, in which case I think things will go back pretty much to normal, apart from things like the retail sector, which I do think there are significant challenges. There were significant challenges for the retail sector even before COVID, and with the advent of everyone at home and seeing, and actually probably some using online shopping for the first time, I think that can only gain momentum. So I think the high street is in for a very, very difficult time.
I suppose that's something that's much debated at the moment, is this road to recovery. Are we in a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery? And whilst I suppose COVID might not become as much of a factor into the future, the question, I suppose, is the change in consumer behavior should the risk of COVID linger. And I mean, maybe retail you've mentioned, but what about offices? Is the concept of an office the thing of the past?
I think it's going to change significantly. I think all businesses now are carrying out a thorough review of their business operating model. So if I use an example, I'll use the example of Investec, which have fantastic offices in Gresham Street in London. But like most businesses based in London of that scale, they have quite large operations and operation staff in those businesses, where we're paying like £75 a square foot for expensive space. Now, I think what we've seen as a consequence of this lockdown is that those individuals have actually worked quite effectively within their own homes. So I can see that there's going to be a reduction in the level of office space required, but I can't see an end of it. I think there'll be a change into more flexible office space. At the moment, it's difficult to see how anyone's going to go back with social distancing. But as I said, if a vaccine or some further knowledge is gleaned around how this disease is going to continue or not going forward, that will depict upon how much space requirements will be needed by respective businesses. In terms of I can see a growth of offices in the provinces, and I say that because if you look at the residential housing numbers in the UK, which generally the government are saying we need 300,000 new homes in the UK every year. Last year we got close to 240,000 homes, which was a very good effort. That's virtually double what it was 15 years prior to that. The reason for that is that we have a thing here called permitted development rights. So you can convert an office in many areas to residential without the need for planning, provided you don't change the bulk and size of the building. So that has helped to maintain those housing numbers. But what it's also done is driven office space down already within the provinces. So if you take a place like Richmond, which is sort of southwest London, even pre-COVID, you'd seen a 40% reduction in available office space in that town. So I think there is going to be I think that's one of the areas that will do well as a consequence of this COVID crisis, as people start to think about working more provincially rather than in central London.
Paul, having been around during 2008 and having navigated out of that crisis then, you must have learned a lot, and there must have been a lot of things that you would be considering and perhaps advice that you would give to those now during COVID-19 as regards how we navigate the recovery out of COVID-19. Perhaps can you share some of your views?
Yeah, I think, going back to sort of 2007 when we saw the first run on the first run on a UK bank being Northern Rock, never been seen before. I think we didn't really face up to what was looming. My own view was that, as a working in a business, in the structured property finance business, we knew that there was going to be a correction, but we couldn't have foreseen what eventually happened. But you had boards and not just at Investec, but other banks and institutions driving people for more and more revenue, particularly those that have been fairly successful, which we were. And you just drop your guard. So we basically pushed into areas that we didn't know that well and had no real local knowledge of. We were a bit late to the party in Manchester, where we opened an office. And, with hindsight, that didn't really do as well as we would have hoped. But I mean, I suppose the one piece of advice I would give is that, in life, it's always about people. It's always about backing the right people and making sure that the money that you're investing carries the right return for that risk. In hot markets, you tend to drop your guard in that respect. Quality people will always find quality opportunities, but more importantly, they know how to react in a crisis situation. You get, during a hot market, a lot of chances coming into the business where you basically take views on those because you're driven, you yourself are driven to doing deals, but also you've been being driven to do more deals by your board of directors. So, the main thing I would say is stick to what you know. Experience is the key, and back the right people, whatever the sector you're in.
Paul, that's been extremely interesting. Thank you so much for the time. That's Paul Stevens. He's the co-founder of UK-based ASK Partners, talking a little bit around GFC in 2008 versus COVID-19 today and the future. Paul, we appreciate the time.
Pleasure. Thanks, Dino.